part 1 of why evolution is not social Darwinism, I covered a brief history of social Darwinism and eugenics as concepts, and I explained why these ideas are political beliefs that are not synonymous with the science that they claim to represent, like evolution, genetics, and natural selection. The primary goal of part 1 was to destroy the misperception that those who understand evolution are inherently social Darwinists. I sought to explain why those two beliefs aren't necessarily compatible, and why many evolutionists are explicitly against the idea of social Darwinism and eugenic tinkering. Because that was my goal in part 1, I didn't really go into a whole lot of detail as to why, exactly, these political ideas are so destructive and ethically terrible. I only briefly explained the potential genetic problems, like we see with dog breeds who've been artificially selected to have a cute but painfully unhealthy body. And I only skimmed the surface with regards to the risks of inbreeding depression, social division and stratification, and the abuses of human rights themselves. This is what part 2 is for, so get yourself comfortable, because I'm going to really dig into these ideas and explain why they're undesirable, first from a scientific and medical perspective, and then from an ethical and political perspective. In part 1, I mentioned that eugenics policies and social Darwinian impulses to weed out the unfit run a serious risk of depleting genetic diversity. If you're a social Darwinian eugenicist, and you identify particular traits that you want preserved, then you will inherently begin to decrease genetic diversity in your captive population. If a group of traits are deliberately being preserved, what does this imply? They're being replicated preferentially, and other traits are being passed on less and less, as the individuals carrying them are deemed unfit or undesirable and are prevented or at least suppressed in their reproducing. The natural progression of this trend will create a gene pool that's composed predominantly or entirely of the preserved traits, as all of the undesired traits have been destroyed. Now at this point, the social Darwinist would likely claim success, but the reality is not so simple. It's highly unlikely that the eugenicist would have defined a full set of traits that can create an entire human. The eugenicist almost certainly focused on a handful of cosmetic traits, like skin color, eye color, hair color, height, and more, under the cultural impression that these traits are associated with greatness, or fitness, or high intelligence, or whatever other nebulous positive attribute you can come up with. And so by focusing on these cosmetic traits, the eugenicist is turning a blind eye to all the traits that work under the surface. The perfect way to illustrate the subtle danger here is the lapdog example that I've discussed several times already. By focusing on a small handful of traits we find cute and desirable, we've created a dog that does indeed have those traits, but at the cost of a huge number of health problems, like breathing difficulty, joint pain, back pain, shorter lifespans, and even an inability to give birth without surgical intervention. Another really important thing that I should mention is pleiotropy, which is one of those things that, on its own, pretty much completely discredits the entire concept of social Darwinism and 20th century eugenics. Pleiotropy is the name for when a gene has a downstream influence on two or more phenotypic traits. If this one gene is mutated, it can affect multiple systems all across the body. For example, consider albinism. An albino person has experienced a mutation to a single gene, called the TYR gene, which codes for tyrosinase. The disabling of this single gene impairs the production of melanin throughout the whole body. The skin is a pale white, the hair is a pale white, and the person's eyes are likely afflicted with strabismus and light sensitivity. Pleiotropy is a good example of how biological systems are composed of extremely integrated and interconnected networks of chemical systems. One thing typically affects multiple downstream things, and all the metabolic pathways exist in equilibrium with each other. When you start applying arbitrary eugenicist standards, and you try to remove superficial traits that you deem undesirable, you will almost certainly start unintentionally disrupting pleiotropic gene interactions. Consider this hypothetical scenario. There's a pleiotropic gene that affects two traits. One of these traits is beneficial, but it's subtle. It's not immediately obvious, like enhanced 3D visual perception or something like that. Now, the other trait is not subtle. It's superficial and obvious. Imagine if that superficial trait was deemed undesirable in a society ruled by a social Darwinian eugenicist. The leader would try to purge out the undesirable cosmetic trait. But in doing so, he's also purging the more subtle, but clearly beneficial trait. In this sense, there is no real way to perfectly isolate and preserve the specific set of traits that the eugenicist deems desirable. They're inextricably linked to all manner of other traits that the eugenicist might find neutral or undesirable, and so there's no real way to go about purifying a population in the first place. This is kind of why I think pleiotropy on its own is enough to thoroughly discredit these political ideas. But because I really hate this Nazi supremacist bullshit, and I'm having fun explaining why it's all unscientific garbage, let's keep going. We can also look at island populations to see the dangers of gene pools with limited genetic diversity. This limited genetic diversity directly translates to a limited capacity to survive environmental stressors, like disease, drought, and limited nutrition. Human populations isolated on islands are thus much more vulnerable to extinction from environmental stressors than populations with greater genetic diversity. A larger population inherently helps with improving genetic diversity, simply due to the fact that there's more people. But if you selectively breed out certain traits for generation after generation, even a larger population can become genetically stale. This concept of genetic diversity is a principal component of evolution. An asexually reproducing clonal population, like corals, have low genetic diversity, and so they're really vulnerable to diseases and parasites, because if one individual doesn't have resistance, it's highly likely that the entire population has no resistance. In sexually reproducing species, there's a degree of genetic and phenotypic diversity all the way down to the level of siblings, and it's this variance in traits that leads to differential outcomes in reproductive success, or fitness, which then leads to certain alleles associated with high fitness traits to be passed on across the generations. And even then, this will only continue so long as the environment stays the same. It's entirely possible that the environment could change, and traits that were once associated with high fitness now aren't. Consider the genetic disease sickle cell anemia. On chromosome 11, there's a gene that codes for hemoglobin. If both alleles of this gene are mutated and non-functional, the person is homozygous for the mutations, and they will show the symptoms of sickle cell anemia. Their red blood cells will be thin and sickle-shaped, and perform their role as an oxygen carrier poorly. Now, if the person only has one mutant allele, they're heterozygous, and they won't have sickle cell anemia. But in a twist of fate, the heterozygous person will be resistant to malaria. Their one mutant hemoglobin allele makes it so that when the malaria pathogen infects a red blood cell, the blood cell ruptures really quickly, and the malaria doesn't have a chance to reproduce, so it really struggles to gain a foothold in the body and carry out an infection. In this way, having two mutant alleles is bad for your health and will lower your fitness. But in an environment where you're regularly exposed to malaria, and malaria is a serious risk of death for you and your society, having one mutant allele is actually good for your health and acts as a fitness enhancer. So to tie this back into eugenics, if a theoretical social Darwinist in control of a sub-Saharan African country decided that sickle cell anemia was a trait associated with weakness, and he rid the country of anyone who had one or two mutant hemoglobin alleles, he would not improve the health and vitality of his society. Even if we completely ignored the damage that was caused by the significant depopulation and the subsequent decrease in genetic diversity, the social Darwinist dictator has just made his population way more vulnerable to malaria. He can expect his people to start dying much more frequently from malaria, because in his Malthusian attempt to destroy the traits that he perceived as weak or undesirable, he ended up removing traits that were critically important, and his entire population is now weaker and suffering from disease because of it. Another example would be a theoretical social Darwinist who believed that myopia was an undesirable trait. Perhaps the social Darwinist thought that nearsightedness was a critical weakness, or something that his people could not tolerate having to suffer for whatever reason, and so he makes a policy that prohibits everyone with myopia from breeding and having children. Well, myopia is generally associated with a higher intelligence, so by trying to extinguish myopia, the social Darwinist is actually making his population, on average, stupider. He's reducing the number of smart people born, simply because they might have myopia. And if a social Darwinist is dumb enough to do this, he is also probably dumb enough to not know about glasses and contact lenses that can cheaply fix the symptoms of myopia. If the problem can be solved cheaply and humanely, it's probably better to do that instead of tinkering with and potentially damaging your own gene pool for generations. Fundamentally, if you try to preserve a handful of traits, especially cosmetic traits like the Nazis and their preference for white skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair, or if you try to drive out and destroy a handful of undesirable traits, this misguided attempt to force the hand of evolution will backfire spectacularly. You'd be unintentionally trimming off the genetic variety that you need to keep your populations healthy and able to overcome natural challenges like disease, drought, parasites, or whatever else it is that might happen to challenge you in the future. You'd be removing pleiotropic alleles that could have any effect, but you have no idea what they are, and you'll only find out what the problems are when they start to manifest themselves in your descendants. If you consider evolution to be a balanced process that works at its own pace, that balance can be symbolized as a body of water with calm, steady waves. If you try to control or direct the process of evolution through a primitive 20th century conception of genetics and inheritance, it's kind of like trying to smooth out the surface of the water. You're not going to smooth it out, you're only going to disturb it even more. The safest way to practice eugenics policy is to make small changes to a small portion of the gene pool, and to intensively study how these changes affect the health of the altered people and their genetic descendants. This slow, meticulous, tightly limited approach is the only way to safely do eugenics policies, because you can potentially identify emergent problems and put a stop to them before they get out of hand, or before they're too widespread to effectively control. Now, there's other medical and genetic issues that we have to look at, besides the risks to genetic diversity and the health of the phenotype. First, let's consider mutations. A mutation can appear anywhere, including a genetic lineage with a high concentration of high-fitness traits. Mutations can cause high-fitness parents to give birth to an extremely low-fitness offspring, or even to a stillborn if the mutation is devastating enough. Mutations can also work in the opposite way, where a genetic lineage that's politically associated with undesirable traits can produce individuals with undeniably desirable traits, or high-fitness traits. For example, many social Darwinists consider being poor in a capitalist society to be indicative of low personal value, or low fitness. This, of course, assumes that a capitalist society is perfectly meritocratic, and someone's success in that society is a perfect reflection of the quality of their genes and the traits that are associated with them. However, this is an assumption that's about as wrong as it is naive and stupid. Because of this fallacious starting assumption, the social Darwinist has no compelling answer for why members of the poor can produce children with a high IQ, or good organizational skills, or good personal discipline. The reason that the social Darwinist is confused is because they want to pin everything on genetics. But the reality is that genetics isn't the whole story. Not all traits are perfectly heritable. Many traits are due to the environment, especially the environment of early childhood. Traits like personal discipline and criminality, often used by social Darwinists as metrics for a person's value, are actually much more influenced by environmental variables rather than pure genetics. Criminality in particular is heavily influenced by stuff like socioeconomic status, age, the number of parks in their neighborhood, the number of available recreational activities like sports leagues and after-school programs, the concentration of lead particles in the air, and even the ambient air temperature. None of these things have anything to do with genetics, and they affect all people regardless of their ethnicity, their gender, or whatever other traits or alleles they might have. This seems like a decent time to transition into the ethics and political consequences of social Darwinism. It's undeniable to say that eugenics has gotten a bad rap due to its history, and the way that it's been applied in the real world. From the ancient Spartans who killed the newborns that were weak and sickly, to the Nazis who killed those who did not match their Aryan ideal, eugenics for much of human history has been a practice in bloodshed and killing. Conversely, in the modern era of advanced technology, genetic modification, and genome mapping, we have the power to screen embryos for genetic defects and selectively choose the healthiest embryos to grow. Where eugenics was once enforced upon the living through breeding regulations and executions, the eugenics of the future will be applied to embryos and the genes themselves, before the individual's life even gets started. Both the legacy of what eugenics was and the prospect of what eugenics can become are extremely controversial, to put it mildly. From a historical perspective, there's a rightful fear and mistrust of eugenics. Eugenics and social Darwinian attitudes in the 19th and 20th centuries encouraged the practice of forced sterilizations, forced ethnic segregation, breeding bans, genetic discrimination, execution of the political prisoners, undesirables, and the institutionalized, and even genocide against undesirable populations. All of these things were done in the name of eugenics, by social Darwinists who thought that they were improving their race or their nation. All of them were misguided, and many of them, like Hitler and Mao, ended up becoming symbols of the extreme evil that humans are capable of. The ugly zenith of eugenics, where all of these things and more were done by governments against innocent people on an industrial scale, took place in the early half of the 20th century. And it was in response to these horrors and atrocities that the long-developing concept of human rights was finally formalized and adopted into international law. It goes without saying that forced sterilizations, ethnic segregation, and execution of undesirables are in direct violation of the basest tenets of human rights. One's freedom of association is violated by ethnic segregation and marriage bans. The right to personal sovereignty is violated by forced sterilizations. And the right to life is obviously violated by politically motivated executions. If you are at all a proponent of human rights and governments behaving in a way that promotes peace and dignity instead of violence and fear, it is very, very hard to simultaneously be a social Darwinist. Social Darwinian eugenics and human rights are fundamentally incompatible. Despite this incompatibility, there are still political philosophies that are sympathetic to social Darwinism and seek to establish Darwinian principles within the ethical boundaries defined by human rights. These political philosophies have turned away from race-based social Darwinism and instead prefer a form of money-based social Darwinism, operating under the belief that possessing wealth implies personal value as a human, and if you have more wealth, you must be a better, more valuable person. Conversely, if you have little to no wealth, well, that just means that you're a bad, inferior, unvaluable person. This political belief manifests itself in policies that protect the wealthy and protect the revenue streams of the wealthy, while stripping protections and welfare from the poor. The poor are essentially punished for being poor, because of the inherent, built-in assumptions of these morally perverted ideologies. You can see this with prosperity Christianity, which puts a divine value on wealth and those who possess it. With neoliberal supply-side economics that gives tax cuts and protections to the wealthy, and the Grover Norquist Republicans who want to strip away virtually every welfare program you've ever heard of under the cruel and callous assumption that suffering caused by deprivation will force people to pick themselves up by their bootstraps and suddenly become not poor. All of these political ideologies push for policies that don't improve society. They cause demonstrable harm to poor people, and they worsen problems like wealth inequality, wage stagnation, and poverty. These policies don't work as they're described, because apart from being callous and inhumane and socially undesirable, they're based on a vicious misunderstanding of natural selection and evolution. With that said, we come to the end of Part 2. This has been a basic rundown of the actual science and the hard data that thoroughly discredits 20th century eugenicist and social Darwinian thinking. In Part 3, I'll explore the emerging phenomenon of designer babies, genome editing, and genetic discrimination, and the consequences that this will have on society as a whole.